They planted the gospel, they multiplied disciples, a church was born that impacted the city with the gospel. Like
Absolutely.
That
Yeah.
is the model that we need to replicate.
Welcome to the Modern Ministry Podcast, where we discuss issues facing ministry leaders today with pastors, theologians, biblical scholars, and Liberty alumni in hopes of offering encouragement and insight towards more fruitful and faithful service and ministry efforts. I am Troy Temple, the Dean of the John W. Rawlings School of Divinity and Liberty Theological Seminary, and we are so glad that you have joined us on this episode. Today, we have the special privilege to hear from Dr. Chris Dowd. Dr. Dowd serves as the director for the Center for Church Advancement here at the John W. Rawlings School of Divinity and has developed a master's degree program in church planning for the Liberty Theological Seminary. He has brought a deep passion and experience to Liberty University. Dr. Dowd is also a key leader with the North American Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention and oversees Liberty's engagement and recruitment of our students with the Gen Sin Project. His research and writing include church planning, church ministry, and practical theology, which fuels his passion for the local church. And he does have a passion for the local church and church planning. He's a teaching elder at Bedrock Church in Forest, and which has launched just recently at the time of this recording, where he leads the teaching team and their network of church plants. He's married to Jesse, and they have two sons, Andrew and Jonathan. On the podcast today, we want to hear more from Dr. Dowd about how church planning impacts the community around it. Dr. Dowd, thank you for being with us on this episode of the Modern Ministry Podcast.
Well, I'm honored to be here. This is exciting.
Yes, indeed. Well, let me jump right in. Church planning is not new and a new venture in the U.S., especially not new among Southern Baptists, but many may consider it only in the context of a new church gathering on Sundays. But the vibrancy of church planning opens a wide variety of initiatives that deliver gospel opportunities and no doubt impact in the local communities in which they reside. And we're gonna dig down deeper to that thought here in just a second. But I want to ask you first, tell us about the journey that brought you to this point when it comes to church planning.
That's a great question. Long story. I'll try to make it as brief as possible. As I'm sitting here in my office here at Liberty, I've got pictures behind me of our founder, Dr. Falwell. I say often here that Liberty University was started by a church planter. And while I was here as an undergrad student, studying pastoral leadership and ministry here, felt the need to go and continue seminary education and went to North Carolina and served there in a church doing college ministry while I was studying and getting an MDiv. And while I was there serving college ministry, I thought, this is it. I thought, I'm designed for this. I love it. I'm hanging out at Duke, UNC, and NC State. We're talking theology. We're drinking coffee, good coffee, and having a great, great time. And a friend of mine from the seminary was planting a church out in North Las Vegas. And so was able to take our college ministry out there to help him. I knew nothing about it, knew nothing about how to help him, but he just needed some extra hands. And so I took some students and we went out there. And next thing I know, I'm taking college students and we're helping a church plant in Las Vegas. And I couldn't let it go. My wife and I, Jesse was with me. We came back from that trip thinking there's something about this that I feel like we're supposed to give our lives to. So after a lot of praying and soul searching, we felt like God was leading us into church planting. And so went back to seminary to pursue a doctorate degree, a DMin, and to study church planting. I'm a think first, jump second, third or fourth kind of guy. Right. And so went back to read all the books that were out and begin to study and write on church planting. When a friend of mine called me and said, maybe we got to plant a church together. And so myself, a guy named John G. Tate and Jeremy Minor moved back here to this area to plant Bedrock Community Church in Bedford, Virginia. Yeah. And then planting churches out of there, planting a church that would plant churches, that plants churches, working with our state convention here at the SBCV, doing some strategy work from church planting, when I got a call from Dr. Troy Temple about the opportunity to come and serve here. And all of a sudden, God was able to put the two passions in my life, which was college ministry and church planting, and create this opportunity for me to be able to serve at Liberty University, my alma mater, to help college students connect to church planting across the country and across the globe. And quite honestly, dream job for me. Can't believe God took my two passions and put them together into one position. And man, I'm humbled and honored to be able to be here.
That's so great. Let me jump in. You mentioned something there about church planting, and you said planting churches that plant churches that plant churches. And so I want to my entry into that conversation is this question: what do you propose are the core biblical texts that guide church planting?
The core, I would say, believe it or not, is the Great Commission. One of them is the Great Commission. I get asked a lot, is church planting a biblical concept? Is it just a pragmatic issue, or is it actually a biblical issue? And where do you find it in the New Testament? Because you don't see it expressly mentioned or implicit. You see it more, or explicit. You see it more implicit. Where is it in the New Testament? And I say the New Testament is proof of church planting.
That's right.
He wrote letters to churches. And so all those letters were written to churches that didn't exist at some point. And at some point, the gospel was planted in a town called Thessalonica or Ephesus or Colossae or Corinth. And now there's a church there. I think the New Testament itself expresses the fact that there's church planting in the New Testament.
That's right.
And all of that came out of this Great Commission. Right? It was the application of this mission that Christ gave to the disciples there in Matthew 28 and in Acts chapter 1.
Right.
In Matthew 28, I believe the Great Commission is not about making disciples. Now, let me clarify that. He says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me.
Right.
Therefore, go. And so immediately, the one who's been given authority doesn't issue suggestions, he gives commands, right? And he says, go therefore make disciples. Sometimes we'll stop there, but you can't. You have to continue. You make disciples by baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you.
Right.
Well, what has he commanded? To go therefore into all the world and make disciples.
That's right.
Baptizing, teaching, and observing all that it's a cyclical concept, which
Continual
is where we get the
mission.
idea of disciples making disciples, right? I have to be obedient as a disciple to the Great Commission.
Right.
And then he says, and I'll be with you to the ends of the earth. And so this idea of how long are we supposed to do this and how far should we do this? As long as we're on this globe, until he comes back to the ends of the earth, we are to be multiplying disciples. I think the Great Commission is about multiplying disciples, not just making disciples. And the best way to do that, to teach them to observe what Christ has commanded, where do you teach disciples? Where do you live out the commands of Christ together, all the one another's that are in the New Testament? That's within biblical community. I think church planting is inherent within the Great Commission. Okay. And I don't think you can get to the ends of the earth teaching disciples to observe all that Christ has commanded without planting local churches. And so I would say the Great Commission is the preeminent passage for church planting and discipleship multiplication.
Right. Oh, that's so good. You know, largely churches see planting as a methodological mission, with a heavy emphasis. So it is a somewhat logistical. There may be an area that seems to be isolated from a church within a reasonable distance, so it just makes sense. Then, so here is our method. We do it this way. But my question is that really accurate with what is prescribed or even described and what we can understand about what we've been told to do as an expression of the Great Commission? In other words, I think this is something that you have said before. How do I get outside of the box with church planning while staying inside the Bible?
Methodology is certainly part of the conversation. The question is, when does it come into the conversation? And I think it comes later, almost last, than it does first. And so I think it's not right to start with methodology. You start with what the gospel is, with who Christ is. You start with a healthy Christology and a soteriology. That then forms my ecclesiology. A lot of the conversations we're having is we're called to plant churches. Well, what is that? Well, it's a church. Yes, but what is that? You keep using that word, right?
Yeah, right.
So my Christology, who Jesus is, informs who the church is. And so
Yes.
my Christology, my soteriology, that gets to focus my ecclesiology. Then my ecclesiology fuels my missiology. Now
Mm,
that church, that body is on mission for the head of the church, which is Jesus. So we
right,
put
right,
Jesus in the gospel in its right place,
right.
which focuses my ecclesiology and then fuels my missiology, and then that gets to form my methodology. I want to talk about models and methodology
Hmm.
after I've clarified the mission of the church as to who that church is, as to who the head of it is, and that's Jesus.
That makes
And
sense.
so we're planting the gospel, rightly so, and forming biblical churches that are on mission for Him.
Hmm.
How you do that, that is largely based on context. And
Yeah,
so we can't start with methodology without missing. I call it putting the cart before the horse.
right.
The gospel is what drives. And so I
Yeah.
can't get the cart out in front of the gospel. We got to get some of those things right first.
And so does that lead you to this understanding, I think, that is giving us great clarity, where there's a major difference between planting a congregation and
Mhm.
planting a church.
Mhm.
How have you seen that yield, I guess, effects in a community or for the church that's being planted in an adverse way when
Mhm.
that's the focus to plant a congregation?
Yeah.
And then what kind of fruit do we see yielded from approaching it from planting disciples in a church versus a congregation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it was Mike Breen, and I'm gonna paraphrase what he said, but what he said was this: if you aim at planting a church, if that's the goal,
Hmm.
then you might make some disciples along the way. If you aim at multiplying disciples, you will plant a church. And
Right.
so we're just moving the aim point to
That's
where it
good.
should be rightly ordered.
Hmm.
You're planting the gospel, is what you're planting. You and I have talked about this before, more of an
Right.
Antiochian kind of ecclesiology.
Yeah.
When the team from Cyprus and Cyrene came into Antioch, they came preaching the Lord Jesus. They came planting the gospel.
Right.
And then disciples were being made, and Barnabas was able to come in and check it out and says, "Man, this is something you guys have going here." And then it became exemplary. And this community of disciples that had been made by planting the gospel there were so influential in their city that Antioch first called those people Christians, right?
Hmm.
So it's the influence of the gospel on a city. They planted the gospel, they multiplied disciples, a church was born
Hmm.
that impacted the city with the gospel. Like
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
is the model that we need to replicate. And unfortunately, I think at times we get caught up in starting worship services
Hmm.
versus planting churches.
Yeah.
Those are two different things and two different methodologies associated with that. If we get back to that Great Commission,
Hmm.
back to the Antioch model, then we're planting the gospel, we're multiplying disciples, and then by God's grace, we'll see churches born that are
Yeah.
impacting their cities with the gospel.
Yeah. In our culture, I think, and you rightly, I think, assessed and described what drives
Yeah,
and so
yeah,
don't get the cart before the horse,
that's right.
because it's the gospel. Evangelism is the lead
Hmm.
on what we do with church planning and really the mission of the church. If you're going to make disciples, it begins with new birth. You can't grow that which has not been born. So evangelism is there, and of course, in our culture today, we many of us have grown up with understanding philosophies and digital practice, or not digital practice, but evangelistic initiatives,
Hmm.
and have experienced it in very different ways. Largely confrontational
Hmm.
is really what has been delivered to the church over the most recent century that we just came out of in the 20th century. It was very confrontational, using a formula or an
Hmm.
acrostic, and those no doubt can still be tools.
Hmm.
But I'm understanding more deeply every single day that actually church planning is can be and probably is the most effective tool for evangelism.
Hmm.
Can you unpack that? Why is that?
Yeah, because what you're doing is you're planting the gospel, and that takes place as the church, the people, not the building or the service, but the body, being plugged in and connected to the community of that context and that culture, living the gospel out.
Right.
Our own Dr. Dempsey says this quite a bit, where we show and share the gospel. Right? It's
Correct.
gospel lived out as well as gospel spoken.
Yeah.
Where Dr. Wheeler in their book on prayer, care, share, where we're plowing the field that we're planting through praying for it, where we are caring for people, loving on them, and then, yes, verbally, openly talking about Jesus.
Right.
There was, a statement a long time ago that said, preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words.
Right.
Words are necessary.
They are very
But the
necessary.
idea was you should also be living this out, right?
Yeah.
Where Paul said to the Thessalonians, you know how we prove to live this out among you.
Yeah.
And so it's this idea of being among the community and the context, living the gospel out and sharing the gospel, that the church, the people, not just the pulpit and the platform on a Sunday morning in a service, but the body out in the community being the church. Church is not something you go to. It's not an event you attend. We are. And so living that in a community is how church planting is effectively evangelistic in a context, because it's the body showing and sharing the love of Christ in a specific community.
Yeah. Well, and that begins to shed a lot of light on that. I think when a church starts in a community with that agenda, with that approach or perspective, it gives you opens up opportunities for doing that. As far as when you're looking to connect with people with the gospel message, and you discover a new community, your story it has the opportunity to be told when you do what Jesus said. Don't tell them just to go be fed and clothed. Give them the clothing, give them the food, show them. And I think that's where we demonstrate with how a church impacts that community. I know we've talked about this before, and it's kind of a large theme for the church planning training program here in our seminary. How does a church then, in what ways have you observed a new church plant impacting a local community?
Yeah, so Robert Lewis wrote a book. We use this. It was really influential for us. It was called Church of Irresistible Influence.
Right.
And the basic principle behind the book was, if your church closed today, would the community notice?
Right.
Right. Would you be missed? The answer is you should be. You should be of irresistible influence in that community. And so that takes hands and feet. That takes intentionality. And not just programming or event, but being out in the community. Vance Pittman, through the president of the Sin Network, would say it this way: the kingdom runs on the rails of relationships.
Right.
And what does it look like for us to impact a community? Now, methodologically, it's different depending on your context. How you do that in a rural context looks a whole lot different than what you do in an urban context or a suburban context.
So true.
So in Bedford, for example, a more rural context, we were able to partner with the city and literally walk into the town manager's office and say, how can we serve this community that we call home? In a more urban context, you're going to need to focus in on a neighborhood or a community or a couple blocks. You need to figure out
a school,
your target, or a school, correct? How can we plug into this community, not just the city as a whole, but here? And the more you narrow your scope, the more you begin to know people and their names and their stories and their context. And you need proximity, not just starting worship services, but being out in the field. You have to plow before you plant. Is a phrase we use a lot here at Liberty. If we're to plant the gospel there, then you have to plow, and you plow through prayer, through serving, through relationship building, and connecting in that community.
Yeah, and no doubt when that's what you're leading with, they see your genuine concern. Yeah. You're not what we've referred to over the years as a spiritual notch on the gun belt.
Right.
And we can go to the next conversation. It also is time that's invested, and you're doing what Jesus did. That the Word became flesh and did what? He dwelt among us.
Right.
And it's essential for us as the church to do that. there's so many good things that are coming out of our program here, and so much fruit that we're seeing, and so much excitement for planting churches. And but I also don't want to miss the opportunity to talk about one element that plays into that that we partner with here, and that is Gen-Sin. And Gen-Sin's been around for just a handful of years, but it's been shown to be very effective in connecting students, especially college students, with opportunities to serve communities that are being impacted by church plants. And can you just describe a little bit about what that looks like in general, but also how it plays a part here at Liberty?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, you and I, we've talked about this before. We have a vocational calling, and not just an occupational calling.
Right.
We have a mission connected to what God wants us to do, and how we can use that vocation as a means by which to expand the kingdom. We don't want to divorce our vocational calling from the church, from the gospel, from the mission that God's called us to. And so the question is, how do we give students some experiences in that? We can talk about that. We can say those phrases a lot, but sometimes they just need to go experience it. They need to touch it. They need to hear it. They need to be in context where they can see that lived out. And so we try to do that through the Gen-Sin program with North American Mission Board, which is an amazing program which gives college students in the summer 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the location, where they can go live out the gospel, helping plant the gospel and plant a church in strategic cities across our country, and really kind of live on mission for a summer. And then when they're here with us during the semester, we're trying to do that locally and regionally as well. So we're partnering with churches here in the Lynchburg area to just give students experiential opportunities to go into the field. To educate our students fully, we need lab environments for them to be able to not only grow in orthodoxy in their head, but also in their hearts, their orthopathy, and with their hands, the praxis, right? The orthopraxy. Right. And so these trips give them that praxis where they can live some of these things out and discern what it is that God's called them to. Right. And so ultimately, whether they're doing some Gen-Sin type things with local churches, regionally through the states of Virginia, North Carolina, and other states around us, or nationally in the summer through Gen-Sin, they are able to serve, but also be able to discern in this season of preparation for them, so that when they leave, ideally for me, I would love to see them be part of planting a new work, planting the gospel in a new place. In my humble but accurate opinion, every student here on this campus is a potential church planting team member. And to see them connect their vocational calling to the glory of God and expanding his kingdom, man, that's what it's all about. And Gen-Sin is an amazing tool to give them opportunities to experience that.
That's so good. And you just put the bookend on that conversation and with the statement about every student. Right. Obviously, we are part of the John W. Rawlings School of Divinity and Liberty Theological Seminary, but we're part of Liberty University, and over 16,000 residential students, many more online. And it's our desire, like you said, that everyone, when they leave, will understand their calling to be a part of a church planting team. That's right. Our teachers, our nurses, our doctors, our business leaders, they can all unite with a church planting team to go win a city for Jesus, as Dr. Jerry Falwell, our founder, admonished all of us to do so many times. That's right. And such an encouragement. We're so excited about what God is doing with that. Dr. Dowd, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Modern Ministry Podcast. It's been such a great encouragement, and I hope that there's many questions that have not been answered. And if that is the case, I encourage anyone listening to contact the Center for Church Advancement right here in the John W. Rawlings School of Divinity and Dr. Dowd. And thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Dr. Temple. It's been great.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for joining us for this episode of the Modern Ministry Podcast. For information about Liberty University, you can go to www.liberty.edu. If you want more information about the John W. Rawlings School of Divinity, you can go to that same URL, liberty.edu/divinity. If you'd like to learn more about the Liberty Theological Seminary, once again, go to liberty.edu/seminary. We look forward to gathering with you on the next episode of the Modern Ministry Podcast, where we are here to encourage ministry leaders with biblical truth, cultural insight, and leadership application.